Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome U.S. Attorney for Southern District Preet Bharara and CNBC Correspondent Seema Mody.
Thank you to Seema for agreeing to ask questions. Usually, I'm the one who asks the questions, and that's what I prefer.
Tables turn.
Yeah, I know. It's good to be with this group of esteemed folks and literary members of the limelight. I think there are people here who have literally written more books than I have read, so I'm a little humbled to be in this group. So look, corruption is one of the many things that we do, and we spend a lot of time on it. And the one thing I should say at the outset is when you say that I have chosen to tackle it, I'm the leader of an office of a lot of very, very good, amazing investigators, amazing prosecutors, and they do all the work, and I come in and sit with a microphone with people like you from time to time. But people have asked the question, is New York worse than other states? I'm not an expert on other states, but I think it's, by some measures and by some polls that have been taken recently, worse than every other state. And if you just look at the track record, and those of you who follow this and who live in New York know this, I think it's the case that we have arrested and prosecuted and convicted at least a dozen state legislators since the time that I've taken office. One statistic that I think is unfortunate and sad if you care about honest government at all, it used to be the case, and I think it's still true, that you have a greater, if you're a New York State senator, you have a greater possibility of being indicted for a crime than of being defeated at the polls if you're an incumbent. So that tells you something about the problem we have here. Now, why is New York worse than a lot of other places? That's a tough question to answer, and I'll try to break it up and you can ask a follow-up. I think culture is a problem, and I think that's true whether you're talking about a problem at a school or you're talking about a problem on Wall Street. I think culture makes a big difference. You don't have a lot of self-policing. The prosecutors in my office working with the FBI and with our investigators, they do a pretty good job of trying to deter other people from doing bad things. But the best police that exist anywhere are the ones who are at the institution itself. And we have found over time that it is a very rare thing for folks in Albany to do any kind of self-policing, to have hearings. We had a gentleman testify at one of our trials last fall. He's the chair of the ethics committee, and he has never been permitted to have a hearing or to mark up a bill relating to ethics. That tells you something about what the problems are. And I think that hopefully over time, with more and more attention paid to the problem, other people will step up. It's not a problem that prosecutors alone can solve, but I think it's a real problem and people should care about it. And part of the solution will be if people, members of the public, care more about the kinds of folks that they're electing and care more about holding people responsible when they have not lived up to their oaths.
My grandfather used to always say that you can't be a politician in India without being a little corrupt. You just can't get out there without a clean slate. Could you apply that to leaders here in New York as well?
No, I actually think that there are a lot of, I get in trouble for, because when I speak in forums like this and in speeches, I say a lot of bad things about corruption, and I say a lot because I think it's deserved. And I say a lot of things about Albany, and I don't mean to cast all of them with that bad phraseology. They're good politicians, they're good public servants. I worked for a time, I don't know if it was mentioned in the introduction or not, I worked in the United States Senate for 4.5 years for the senior senator from New York. So it's not like some people in Albany have criticized me and my office for being people who don't understand politics, or people who don't understand how government works, or people who just hate the legislative branch. That's obviously not true. I spent 4.5 years, I moved my whole family to Washington and worked in the U.S. Senate and worked as chief counsel of a subcommittee. And one of the things we did was we engaged in oversight of the executive branch. So I know and respect people in politics. I know and respect people who have given up a lot of other money that they might be able to earn in the private sector by engaging in public service. It's not for me, but other people have done it, and I think there's a lot of good folks. So I don't think it's the case you have to be a little bit corrupt. You may have to be a little bit crazy to go into politics, I think, these days. But I think there are a lot of good folks, and the more and more we get good folks to come into politics, the better we'll all be.
Given that you have this front row seat, though, are you ever shocked by what you find? I mean,
by
extortion.
These people? The front row? Oh.
These are serious things. Extortion, money fraud, money laundering.
So, I'm not that shocked, and I'm not that surprised. Every once in a while, you think, why are people as stupid as they are? And mean to offend stupid people when I talk about politicians who break the law, but I'll give you an example of the kinds of things that you find with some of the folks that we end up charging. We spent some amount of time investigating and prosecuting not only the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, Sheldon Silverett, last year, but also his counterpart in the Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos, who represented parts of Long Island. And for a period of time, it was covert, but then somehow the press got a hold of it. And during that period of time, we had one or more wiretaps that were authorized by a judge on some of the people that we were investigating. And a wiretap call that was played at the trial went as follows. The allegation was that Dean Skelos, who's the Senate Majority Leader, was pressuring companies to give jobs, really no-show jobs, for his son, Adam Skelos. And there's a call that was intercepted between Adam Skelos and Dean Skelos. And Adam is saying, because of the attention that had come to bear on the investigation, he's saying to his father how frustrated he was. And he says, and this is a quote, it's like effing Preet Bharara is listening to every effing phone call, which was true of that phone call. So you wonder sometimes if someone is literally talking about the frustration of being investigated and then is saying something as incriminating as that. That was one of our best pieces of evidence at trial.
What leads someone...
Some of you may have voted for these people.
And what leads someone, do you think, now that you've interacted with these type of individuals, many of them, is it entitlement, this feeling of being invincible, that they can surpass the law?
So I don't know. That's a great question that I get a lot, and I get it a lot from you and folks at your network, usually when we talk about Wall Street crime. And I think my answer is the same. It's not clear what motivates people to break the law or not break the law. Some people are just evil. The judge who sentenced Bernard Madoff, which also was our case, said famously when he sentenced him to, I think, 150 years in prison, that Bernie Madoff was an evil person. There are some people who go astray and they have a lot of financial pressure and they need to make ends meet. That's some of the allegations that we have in the case against some members of the executive branch in New York from a week ago. Some people think they can get away with it and they feel entitled, like you suggest. I think that there's something to be said for people who are at the intersection of power and money that are tempted to do things because they think they can't get caught for it. If there's one theme I can say comes up over and over again with respect to the politicians that we have charged, and we have this from body wires and wiretap intercepts, and also from debriefing witnesses, at some point there are people who have taken an oath to serve the public, and they don't make as much money as other folks. And they get kind of irritated by this. And we had a guy we charged even before I came to the office, and was sentenced after I came to the office, who basically said, here are these other people getting rich. When do I get my chance? I do all these good things for the public. When do I get my opportunity? And we charged another person recently, and I won't talk about the case because it's pending. We charged the head of a correction officers union, who we described in the complaint, saying that he wanted to get something for steering money, the pension money of the correction officers in his union, to an investment outfit. He wanted to get something out of that, and as we allege, he took tens of thousands of dollars in bribes. I think and there's no sole motivation that explains everyone's misconduct that we have charged and proved. But an underlying theme in a lot of the cases is they feel like, what, I've done a lot for people. I should get mine too, and my public servant salary is not sufficient for me.
On the state level, do you think there is wrongdoing that hasn't been uncovered yet?
Yes. And if you guys have names and numbers, give them to me, please. It's like anything else. Prosecutors, one of the reasons I come and talk about these kinds of issues, whether we're talking about corruption on Wall Street or corruption in the state legislature or in the executive branch for that matter, is no prosecutor can get every bad guy, and we rely on the cases that we bring to send a message to other folks and to deter other people, right? So the multiplier effect of having one case against one bad person hopefully tells the 3 other bad people who are thinking about doing that crime not to do them, because there's no way that we can get everybody. In the same way, every once in a while we arrest a narcotics dealer, and he decides he wants to cooperate, and he wants to tell us who the supplier is, and we'll say, because we're required, our view is that person has to own up to everything that he has done before, and he'll say, no, that was the first time I ever did it. which is it's just not the case because we're not omniscient and we're not omnipotent. So we don't know how much other crime is going on. But the good money is if we're catching some, that there are others that we haven't gotten.
One area of focus has been for you tackling widespread financial crime. You've earned the reputation of being Wall Street's cop, specifically when it comes to insider trading. You've successfully prosecuted at least 80 cases.
I think it's higher.
A little higher than that.
I don't have an exact score, and we had the setback. So.
Yet, with all of these events happening, there's still new revelations of investors breaking the law, new stories that come up. Is this another example of how they don't really learn until it actually happens to them?
Yeah, I think so. The Wall Street crimes are even more interesting to me, in some ways, as a human matter, because you have people who I have described as having more money that you can sometimes, some of them, more money than you can spend in a lifetime, more accolades than you can put on the walls of the gigantic houses that you might be able to purchase, and still engaging in crime, insider trading, accounting fraud, other kinds of crimes. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. I think there's some folks, for example, in the case of Rajaratnam, who some folks here may have heard of. The man had $1 billion, and he's doing, I forget if it's 11 or 12 years in prison, when he didn't need to do that. And there are a lot of examples of that. I'm not sure why that occurs. I think it's in part a feeling, and again, I'm not an armchair psychologist, and I'm not a life coach. I'm just a prosecutor, but these are questions that come up from time to time, human questions about why people do what they do. It's not clear. I think in part, there are periods of time when people think there's no enforcement, and there are periods of time when people think, oh, well, he's doing it, and he's doing it. I need to do it too. There's a lot of pressure from management, and you know this from your reporting at CNBC. There's a lot of pressure to make the numbers. There's a lot of pressure to have edge, which is code in some precincts for getting inside information. And some people aren't able to resist that. And even when people are making, there was a suggestion with respect to another defendant we had who had, I think, assets of $100 million, which is, if I'm doing the math correctly, about $100 million more than I have. And the suggestion was he was consorting with people who were billionaires, and so there's a certain kind of keeping up with the Joneses at that level. Right. That seems odd, but at every level, I guess, as a human matter, people see other folks who are doing better than they are, who are dumber than they are, who are not as educated and refined as they are, and they think, well, I don't understand why I don't have $1 billion, so maybe I should cheat too. And these are all speculative theories about why people do what they do, which maybe can be spun into various great works of literary fiction by some members of the audience, but that's my best guess. You
mentioned Rajaratnam. Around the story of Galleon Capital, some of the Indian journalists I found took notice of the fact that there were a lot of South Asian names, Rajaratnam, Anil Kumar, Rajat Gupta, and that you were targeting the South Asian community. What's your response to that?
Well, if those are South Asian journalists, then they're I want to call them stupid, but it's a stupid remark in many ways, an observation. And I have a couple things to say about that. First of all, we don't target anyone based on their ethnicity and their background. In fact, in some cases, I had no idea. I generally have no idea the race background, and sometimes you can tell from a name. But the way cases get done, as I said before, they're done from the ground up. I don't walk into the office and say, "Bring me the head of an Indian." Like, I did that one time, only one time. And you would have agreed on that guy. No, that's a joke. The way it works is people do their investigations, and professional prosecutors and professional investigators and FBI agents, they see where the money takes them. They see where the leads take them, and they prosecute as is seen fit. And I've said this many times as well. There's a period of time when there are some people. First of all, it's not crazy that when you're talking about an insider trading network, that the people who are connected to the first person that you suspect of a crime knows other people socially and professionally who may be of the same ethnicity. I used to do Russian organized crime prosecutions in my office when I was a line prosecutor. And what people could have said at the time, you're going after Russians and it's not fair because you pick this Russian and then you pick this other Russian who's connected to him. In point of fact, I have been banned from Russia, but that's for totally different reasons. but it's not that irrational. And I remember saying also to some folks that there's a place where every day there are defendants who are Indian, and the prosecutor is Indian, and nobody freaks out about it, and it's called India. And it's not crazy, and the vast majority of people that have been charged by my office and have been charged even in the narrow area of Wall Street insider trading have not been South Asian. So, sometimes it happens, sometimes, people make a big deal of it, and I find it kind of silly.
But when these stories do come out, journalists and the media, they love to try to extrapolate a certain trend or a discussion around is there something about the Indian culture that condones corruption or taking shortcuts? What are your thoughts?
And I don't think so. I mean, look, I'm a product of Indian culture.
Firozpur?
Firozpur, that's right. Any Firozpur? No, nobody?
Punjab?
Okay. Punjab, that's a bigger place to mention. No, I mean, look, I think that if you were raised right, and my brother and I were raised by my parents from India, and I was born in India, and they would try to teach us not just American values, but also the values they understood to be Indian values, which is hard work, respect for your family, respect for your parents, doing well in school, study being incredibly important. The central theme of my childhood was that studying was incredibly important, and you can do anything if you study. You can be poor until you're 47 years old if you study really hard. That's what we learned, and so I don't know that there's anything that you can point to in Indian culture. I don't think that's the case.
You also received some criticism over the handling of Indian diplomat Devyani Khobragade, charged with visa fraud. If you look back now to that time, do you regret how that was handled?
Look, that case, as some people may remember it, and it caused a lot of grief, mostly to my parents who would read things that were written about their son. And again, like every other case that is not the hugest case in the world, it was a mid-level diplomat. I only heard of this person's name the day before the arrest because someone sent me an email saying this might be interesting tomorrow. It was a case that was developed by the State Department. It was a case that was investigated by the State Department, and the State Department asked us to prosecute the case. And my folks thought it was a viable case, and not the case of the century, but an important case. And we would stand by it. And then all hell broke loose, and there was an election going on in India at the time. She had a father who said a lot of things, and I said he was going to go on a hunger strike. I assume he's very, very skinny at this point. And a lot of things were said about why we had brought the case. I talked about this once. I gave the commencement address at Harvard Law School a couple of years ago, and it had been the case that news outlets in India thought it was an impressive thing that a son of India had become the United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And then overnight, they went to calling me all sorts of names, saying I was self-loathing. My father called me up one day, and my parents get all the Indian channels on their cable network, on Dish TV or whatever it is. And I think they had a guy who had a big picture of me behind him, said I was the worst person in the world. I'm sort of the Indian Keith Obermeyer. And there's a lot of discussion about this, and you realize it got so out of control, people kept suggesting that I was interested in politics myself, and that I had somehow decided to target this unknown mid-level diplomat because it would help me with votes if I ever ran for office in the state of New York, showing no understanding of me or the state of New York.
Sounds like a good story. I
guess, right? And at some point, people became more and more obnoxious about what they were saying. And as I tell the story, I had to explain to my daughter what an Uncle Tom was, because she was looking over my shoulder, and I was trending on Twitter in India a number of times, not in a good way. And she asked me, Daddy, what's an Uncle Tom? I explained what it meant. And then my favorite part was, this is when I realized a little bit, not to take it too seriously, someone wrote in India, obviously what Preet Bharara is doing is he's trying to prove himself to his white masters, presumably Eric Holder and Barack Obama. So that's when you can kind of smile at it. And so I went to India a couple of weeks ago, had a nice trip. People seem to understand that what we're about is the rule of law. We're not about self-loathing, and we're not about going after anybody for their ethnic origin or anything else. People break the law, and we discover they've broken the law, and the professional judgment of the career people is that they should be prosecuted. That's what we do. And we don't care how rich you are, how big you are, how connected you are, how loud your father is. None of that matters to us, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, makes sense. You did go on a trip to India recently.
I did.
And you had some interesting conversations around national security and terrorism. What did you learn?
I can't tell you. So I went as part of a delegation from the United States. It was a national security mission. We met with national security counterterrorism folks in Delhi, other members of the police, to talk about how we can cooperate more, to talk about, in particular, the terrorist threat and how to combat it on the internet. As I'm sure many of you have heard our FBI director talk about, and law enforcement and intelligence agencies in India also talk about this. It's now the milieu of choice for people who want to do other innocent citizens harm, to use social media and the internet. So we talked about issues of encryption. We talked about how to make sure we can find out who the lone wolves are, because it used to be the case in the early terrorism prosecutions that we used to do, that if you're a member of Al-Qaeda, you could discover if somebody went to get training in Afghanistan, and you could figure out from the intelligence sources you had and the law enforcement sources you had what they were buying, what weapons they were learning to use. And now you have people who are being inspired simply by Twitter or the internet, and you don't know who's going to be doing what. And the interesting thing is, right the week after we came back, a week or 10 days after we came back, the first major crisis that my office had to deal with since the Times Square bomber, Faisal Shahzad, 6 years ago, was this gentleman, Mr. Rahami, who decided he wanted to plant a bomb on not that far from here, on 23rd Street and then on 27th Street. And that is a person who was a little bit known beforehand, but a lot you can't tell anymore. And a lot of what radicalizes people occurs on the internet. So it was mostly a discussion about that, and that our countries, although different, have a lot in common in terms of how to deal with the threat. India and America, we had conversations about this, are open democracies. And that's a great thing, to be in an open democracy. But it's a lot tougher to catch people who want to destroy other human beings in an open democracy. And there's a lot of discussion about how to handle that in a proper way.
Yeah, how do we win the fight? I mean, we had a cybersecurity conference last week for CNBC, and the NSA director told us that these hackers now have access to all information. There are no boundaries, no limits. When you hear something like that, you think, well, then how do we win the fight against these individuals, whether they're from Russia, China, or maybe India?
Yeah, no, it's very scary, and I think part of the way you go about it is we have the meetings that we have. We need to be recruiting into government people who are as smart as the people that we're going after. We have basically multiplied our efforts on cyber and the cyber threat, both national security side and also criminal side, tenfold since I've been in the office. The FBI and the Secret Service, who are the principal pursuers of the cyber threat and response to the cyber threat, I think have done the same, times 10, times 20. And I think we need to get the public involved and understand what's at stake here. I mean, a lot of the bad things that happen are because people are not taking care of their own networks. I go and speak to a lot of CEOs and to a lot of businesses to talk about this threat. And you realize that over time, even though we're talking about it all the time, that companies have not taken basic precautions and basic training for their companies. I like to use an old medical analogy, and that is, for a long time, people tried to figure out how do we best save lives, and it turns out that one of the greatest medical advances, even though I'm not a doctor, much to my parents' chagrin, I can talk about this. One of the greatest medical advances was just teaching people in hospitals and in operating rooms to be clean and to wash their hands. And it seems too simple in an area of science, and you think you need to have complicated machinery and cutting-edge techniques, but the simple washing of hands saved untold numbers of millions and millions of lives. And that was a great thing for medicine. And people get tired of hearing about having simple encryption, taking stuff at companies, the equivalent of washing your hands, having a strong password, making sure that things that are very, very important, you don't keep on a connected network. And so part of I think what people have to realize, whether they're in government or they're in corporations, is there are simple measures you can take that'll go a long way to protecting you. It's not going to always protect you from everything, but it's astounding and shocking sometimes how people aren't even doing some of the basic things.
Taking a step back, did you ever think small-town Punjabi boy from Firozpur would be tackling terrorism and taking down multi-billion-dollar hedge funds in New York? Was that the dream?
Not, I wouldn't put it that way. No. Look, I think it's one of the greatest things. You know, we talked about ethnicity and culture. I think it's one of the greatest things about this country that a kid named Pritinder Singh Bharara, which is how you need to say it.
That's how you should say it when you're on TV.
Next press conference. That I could be, and I think this is part of what was animating folks during the Cobra Gade, issue. Was it? I think, and I love the country from which I came, but I didn't see a lot of people who were not Indian at the conference room table when we had our meetings a couple of weeks ago. It's one of the most diverse countries in the world, but it's not diverse like America and like New York City. And I think it didn't occur to people that I might, based on merit and based on just doing my job, be able to become the chief federal law enforcement official in the area, in Manhattan. And so part of what I think was feeding the criticism and the lack of understanding, I think, was this view that I must be doing something. I must be trying to appear white. I must be trying to please people who are above me and shed being Indian. I've never shied away from being Indian. People like to talk about how I love Bruce Springsteen, and I do, but I like Bhangra music too. That's just not as interesting when the Washington Post writes a profile, I think, of me. And I have my name. I didn't change my name to Peter. So there's a lot that it says about America that a person like me, who wasn't even born in the United States, has the word United States in my title, and that my chief of terrorism for a long time was named Guru Anjan Sani. And he was the person who was in part in charge. He's now in private practice, making a lot more money than I am. But for a while, and he is a turban-wearing, beard-wearing Sikh, which probably would surprise some people in a lot of places, thinking that here you have, and also born in India, that you have somebody who doesn't look like your average clean-cut, white FBI agent in charge of terrorism prosecutions in the city of New York. To me, that's an amazing thing about the United States.
Tanu Punjabi Andiye?
Hold up.
I asked two hedge fund friends of mine who are analysts to attend this talk once we were told that we were having this conversation on Sunday, and they said, we'll politely decline. I would like to stay as far away as possible from Preet Bharara.
I wasn't planning to arrest anyone tonight, so they could have.
But do you think, when you look at the way you're conducting these cases, these investigations, are you leading with fear, and is that working? I don't feel like I look very scary at all. That's a little scary.
Yeah, that's heavily photoshopped. And my children are certainly not scared of me. If I need anything to be done in the house, I tell them Mommy's going to get mad, and she doesn't have subpoena power. Look, I wouldn't fear. Like, fear is not the phrase I would necessarily use, although I think it's an appropriate word. As I said before, we can't get all the bad guys, so we have to rely on people looking at what things have happened to other folks, and so the hope is particularly in the white collar area, and I've often said, in the white collar area, when you're talking about some of these people that you deal with, you don't get to that level without being really smart. And in particular, and they go to some of the best business schools in the world. And you particularly don't get there without being smart in a certain way, and that is to understand numbers and understand risk and understand cost and benefit. And so part of the job for us, and I guess it's related to fear, is to make the cost-benefit analysis for them be more about the cost than the benefit. So before, when I talked about the example of the person who's worth $100 million and is deciding to knowingly engage in a federal crime in order to grow the 100 million to something more than 100 million, I'm hoping they're thinking about me in my office and thinking about their friends who have gone to prison. It's not worth being separated from your liberty for a long period of time. And any business school person would tell you that. And I don't think these people would make the same, it's odd that they wouldn't make the same kinds of mistakes in a business judgment but they make these kinds of mistakes when they're talking about their own livelihood and their own freedom. I don't fully get it, but part of our job is to instill some fear, yes.
You've had a lot of success cracking down on corruption on Wall Street, to a point where now the mere hint of an investigation from you or your team can be damaging to a company or an individual's reputation. One example is Level Global, a $4 billion hedge fund. In 2010, the FBI raided the hedge fund. The founder, David Ganek, no criminal charges, yet he still had to shut his fund down. He faced redemptions. When you conduct these investigations or raids, do you think about the unintended consequences?
Yeah, we think about the collateral consequences all the time. Particularly the people who are doing the white-collar work, they know that, and certainly in the public corruption work, reputations are fragile and reputations are important. And I've often said, people sometimes liken me or people in my office to, you said the word cop or sheriff. In some ways, we're more like firefighters. And in the same way that when a firefighter gets word that there's smoke coming out of a home and you have to go check it out, we're sort of the same way. When there's smoke at a hedge fund or some other institution, it's our obligation to investigate. In the same way that a firefighter needs to take care not to do undue damage to the building, you may have to break a window or break through the door. And most of the time, because they're expert and they're professionals, when there's a certain kind of smoke that they see emanating from a home, not coming out of the chimney, there's a fire. And they're saving people's lives when they go in there. Not only saving the lives of the people in that residence, but the lives of the people in the houses neighboring that residence as well. Now, sometimes it turns out it wasn't a fire, and the door has been broken and windows have been broken, but that does not relieve the responsibility of the firefighter or the sheriff or the cop or whatever from doing their job. Now, you need to do it with great sensitivity, and you need to understand that investigation can cause collateral consequences to a company, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we need to shrink from our responsibility and hide under a desk and never engage in any investigation at all because no one's above the law. Because if that was true, then that would be a shield against all manner of investigation. I don't believe that would be an appropriate balance.
But is there a discussion around how to ensure one has sufficient evidence available before, or sufficient evidence to warrant an investigation or raid?
Yeah, we're always taking into account, and probably in the political sphere even more, taking into account what it means to investigate a person or an institution and what it means if it got out. Which is why, notwithstanding members of your profession who are very adept at finding out about our investigations, we try to do everything in secret. That's why the grand jury is secret. That's why it's a federal crime to leak anything that happens in a grand jury. That's why sometimes we don't take certain steps until it otherwise becomes public, because we don't want people to know what we're doing. A, because we want evidence to be destroyed. B, we don't want people to flee. But C, also, further to your question, we don't want to engage in something that's going to cause reputational damage if there may not ultimately be a crime committed. Now, sometimes, as you know, in the financial area, everyone knows that something bad has happened, whether you're talking about the London whale or you're talking about the collapse of a company or a writing down of profits. Then everybody knows something happened, and people very quickly find out there's an investigation going on, and very often there are no charges that arise from that. And the point I make, I speak at business schools all the time, and I go to all the major business schools. I go to Harvard, I go to Stanford. Every year I go and I speak to the entire first-year class at Harvard Business School. I've been doing it for 5 years. And one of the things I say is when you go to your business, our job is to be sensitive as much as possible, consistent with doing our job and holding everyone accountable to the rule of law. But your responsibility is to be that much more beyond reproach. And if your industry is such, or your company is such, that's so fragile, and there are differences in fragility, and your business is so fragile that the mere opening, understanding my sensitivity, but so fragile that the mere opening of an investigation or issuing of a subpoena is going to cause your business to collapse. Maybe there's a problem with your business model, and maybe there's a problem with your reputation generally, because we are often opening up investigations into business enterprises, and they don't collapse. So there is some responsibility on the part of those institutions who complain about our investigations. What is it about your institution that the mere hint of an investigation causes everyone to flee? I would submit that sometimes it's something having to do with them, not having to do with us.
Or maybe it is more about the hedge fund industry, how these institutions are set up, many times built on confidence. That's why the sniff or the mere hint of something potentially going wrong scares investors away.
It can be, yeah.
Well, either way, your work on Wall Street, taking down some of these hedge funds, has garnered a lot of attention, not just from those in the financial industry, but the entertainment world as well. Billions, Showtime, widely based.
She's laughing. She knows why that's funny.
Widely based off of your work that you've done. How does that feel?
Has anyone here seen Billions? So for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a series on Showtime. Written by Andrew Ross Sorkin and a couple of great producers, and it stars as the United States Attorney Paul Giamatti, who's a great actor, with whom I had dinner when he was preparing for the role. And I would just tell you, it's a highly fictionalized.
Why don't you explain that?
Highly fictionalized view of the United States Attorney. So when they said they were doing the show, people thought that was kind of cool, because most of the time when you see shows about prosecutors, it's about the district attorney. And I'm not the district attorney, I'm the United States Attorney, and that's different. And they don't do as many entertainment shows about my office, and this is one of the rare ones. So I met with Paul, I met with the producers, we talked about the office a bit. It sounded like it was going to be a certain kind of show. My parents were excited about it. My conservative Indian parents were excited about it. And I went to the premiere, and I got my picture taken with Paul Giamatti, and it was really excellent. My parents said, "Are you going to watch the show when it comes out on Sunday?" I said, "Yes." So presumably everybody was tuned to the first episode of Billions, and if those of you who have seen it know what I'm about to say, and those of you who haven't will, and you will censor this as appropriate, the cameras. The opening scene of the show that I was all excited about has the United States Attorney, played by Paul Giamatti, not wearing any clothes, lying on the ground, his hands bound, engaging in an act of sadomasochism with a woman with high-heeled shoes. All I know is my parents never mentioned the show again. They didn't ask me, Preet, what do you think? But nothing. Again, it's as if the show doesn't exist.
So not an accurate
highly
depiction.
Fictionalized.
At all. But the entertainment part of taking your work and putting it on Showtime, kind of a cool feeling? Something you'd like to explore
Well, it was until that first scene. Look, it's an interesting thing, right? And your profession gets shown on TV. The journalism profession. Homeland was about the CIA, and it's interesting that they take a lot of liberties with a lot of things. I think it's interesting that anybody bothers to have United States Attorney and the United States Attorney's office portrayed in film in some way, but they take a lot of liberties, and they have they do a lot of things that we would never do, in the same way that Carrie on Homeland. Most CIA agents don't sleep with multiple sources to get information, as far as I'm aware. So they take it, I think, in stride, and I think they wish it was a little bit more accurate. But I think to make it fully, a lot of what we do is a lot more boring than you might think. Trials are more boring than you might think. Investigations often involve sitting down, looking at reams of documents, doing spreadsheets to try to find where the money went, and it's not as as fast-paced as you might expect. So it's fictionalized, and I think that's fine.
But is it an area you would like to explore going forward? Entertainment, production? I mean, you are speaking at a literary arts event.
No,
we're starting to wonder.
No, I'm hoping to read more books from time to time.
Will you be writing your own book?
I don't. The problem with writing a book is then you have to say things about people who are still alive and who you might run into. And I'm more polite than that.
10 years from now, what is Preet Bharara doing?
Watching reruns of Billions, wondering about the good old days when people would invite me to things like this. I don't know. I don't know.
Is there an untapped opportunity, something else that also piques your interest? Politics, perhaps?
No. Look, I'm very lucky in some ways that the only thing I ever wanted to be professionally was a prosecutor, and be a prosecutor in this office. And people may not understand what the office is about, and lawyers have a bad reputation in a lot of ways. I'm in the only kind of place on earth where our only job is to do the right thing. Our only job is to do justice. We never bring a case we don't believe in, not just with our mind, but with our heart. We never take a position we don't believe in, and I know others may disagree with us, but we tell our folks that if you come here, everything that comes out of your mouth you need to be proud of. And that's not true of most people in my profession, and it's a system that we have, and the defense lawyer doesn't get up there and believe what he says when he says my client is not guilty. Most of the time, that's not true. It's a good system. It needs to be an adversarial system like that. I like to be in the position that I'm in, which is we wake up every morning and we try to do what's right, and we try to protect the public, and we try to make our community a little bit better. I don't know anything else in the world, given my very limited skills and small brain capacity, that I could do that could be as fulfilling and gratifying as this. And so I was lucky enough not only to get a job as a line prosecutor in the office, which was my dream, but then somehow, bizarrely, at the age of 40, to become the head of what I think is the best law office in the world. So it's all downhill from there. Maybe fast food cook.
What is a day like for Preet? You wake up at what time?
So the house starts getting, because there are small people in my house. So things start happening in like the 6 o'clock hour, towards the end of the 6 o'clock hour. I'm not a morning person. I'm forced into being something of a morning person. I do a lot of work. I don't have a typical day, to answer your question. I don't like a lot of regularized meetings. I keep thinking maybe I'm doing something wrong. I should have a staff meeting at X time, and I should have unit chiefs meetings at other times. I don't like that, and those of you who run institutions, I don't know how you run it. I run an office that has about 450 people. We have a budget of about $50 million. Most of what I do is not being a lawyer. Most of what I do is being a CEO and a manager. It's one of the first things I say when I talk to a lot of people you talk to who are in the business profession, to understand that my job is not that different from them. The most important things that I do, and it can happen any day of the week, in some ways is not giving a green light to a case being brought, because most of them they don't bother to tell me about, because we do thousands of cases a year. Some I spend a lot of time on, like the cases against the Assembly Speaker. I might literally take my own pen out and edit, on a daily basis, documents that are going to the court or to the other side. But for the most part, the most important thing I do, like the most important thing that any CEO of any size company does, is make sure that morale is high, make sure that we have the right people doing the right things, make sure we're charting a course for the organization, make sure that I'm giving people what they want, and mostly getting out of the way so they can do the brilliant and amazing work that they do.
It's a tough job, but clearly you've been very successful at it. We're going to end this discussion right now and open up the floor to Q&A and see if there's anyone who has questions about you, enforcing law, politics, corruption.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Yes.
Hi, this is Avneet with the Schiller Institute. Thank you for the discussion. I have a question. You in 2011 prosecuted Deutsche Bank, and you have a situation today where the too big to fail banks are even bigger. Deutsche Bank itself is on the verge of, the whole system's on the verge of collapse. Why hasn't United States, and I want your comment on that, what's holding back the United States Congress from enacting basic measures like washing of hands, measures like Glass-Steagall, which would have a very profound effect? And why don't we have another Ferdinand Pecora and a Pecora Commission?
I think the Pecora Commission is not named after my favorite appetizer from an Indian restaurant. So those are great questions. They're a little bit above my pay grade. I worked in the Senate for a while. I'm no longer there, thankfully. And so I don't know why certain things get passed and certain things don't. There are a lot of people in other venues who would say the opposite from you. I believe there's a debate later this evening where two different points of view will be clashing on issues of regulation versus non-regulation. So I can't really address that. But what I can say from my own perspective on the issue of going after banks, I don't think any office has been more aggressive and hours. And I think for a while, prosecutors overlearned the lesson of Arthur Andersen, which some years ago went out of business. We were talking before about collateral consequences. That's one, right? And so one of the ethical questions that prosecutors have to ask is, if you decide to indict an institution, not just individuals, what's going to happen to the shareholders, what's going to happen to the customers, what's going to happen to the employees of the company who may not have done anything wrong? And for a long time, I think that was answered the negative. You don't do anything, because Arthur Andersen failed, and it was, some people think, not the most impressive prosecution in the history of the world, but that went too far. And so in the last few years, I have talked about, leading up to the dates when we prosecuted Bank Paribas, BNPP, in France, the largest bank in France, and other folks in the Justice Department prosecuted Credit Suisse. And part of the reason I thought that was important was we wanted to show that you can hold a financial institution accountable criminally, notwithstanding what regulations you're talking about, and the sky would not fall. And for a long time, financial institutions and defense lawyers for financial institutions would say, if you take the slightest action against us, the bank will fail, everyone will be unemployed, the world will come to an end as we know it. And it seemed like that couldn't have been true and was overstated, and it turns out it wasn't. It was overstated. And BNPP paid a fine of, I think, $9 billion, and Credit Suisse gave a similar fine. And reforms were undertaken, and lots of people lost their jobs. So I think it's possible to hold large financial institutions accountable as to the particular regulatory structure that's for other people.
How you go about prosecuting? Are you looking for tips from people and whistleblowers, or do you also monitor certain large businesses? And then once you have, let's say, some insight that something might be going wrong, are you trying to get sources within that institution that you can have, somehow to get more information? I'm just wondering, what are some of the basic ways you go about doing that?
Yeah, so the answer is all the above. I gave a talk earlier this week, last week. I forget, Sunday, right? So last week in Albany, and I got a similar question on public corruption. We have brought cases against often pharmaceutical companies because there's a whistleblower who files a suit. We have gotten cases started because you arrest somebody for X, and they want to help themselves. And so they say, well, you know what, you found me with these drugs, I'll tell you these 5 doctors who are committing crimes. Sometimes it's that. And sometimes it's just by paying attention to what happens in the press, in her profession. And for example, the cases that we just brought with respect to bid rigging that we allege in the Buffalo Billion that the governor touted in a big way, that investigation started because members of the press started writing stories that made it seem like the bidding was rigged. And there was some funny business going on with how those contracts were awarded, and it was gerrymandered. So it's sometimes the press, it's sometimes common sense, it's sometimes whistleblowers who come in, and we're happy to do cases no matter how they come in. But we cast a wide net. I think it's important for us to read the paper every morning. Sometimes agents bring in cases, sometimes agents have some of the best ways to get cases is to have sources. And there's human intelligence, in particular, that's important when you're talking about terrorism. In those cases, it's not because the press is writing a story about a bad guy who wants to plant a bomb at the Statue of Liberty. That's because there are tripwires set in place. There's a mining of data to make sure that we're seeing things that are happening. And a lot of the time we rely not just on the press, but on people who, when they see something bad going on, report it and blow the whistle.
Gentleman over here had a question.
My question is about sentencing. To some extent, your work, the work of the prosecutors, is really not fully complete until the sentence, assuming that the prosecution has been successful, until the sentencing has occurred. There have been some cases where it's been difficult to understand the sentences passed, generally on the low side. What is your view? Well, could you make some comments about sentencing, and what's your view about it? Yeah.
I think the most difficult thing that any human being can do in the world of criminal justice is determine how much time another human being should go to prison for. People sometimes say, do I have an aspiration to become a judge? I don't. I have no interest in becoming a judge for a lot of reasons. But among the 10 reasons that I want to become a judge is, it might sound odd coming from a prosecutor whose office recommends sentences all the time. One of the reasons that I want to become a judge is I have no interest in trying to figure out metaphysically, whether if you commit a particular crime, whether justice is best served by sending you to prison for 47 months or 49 months. And it becomes a numbers game a little bit, and I'm just not constituted, I think, to enjoy doing that. And I don't think any judge enjoys it. You talk to any judge, they say the hardest thing that they do is figuring out what the sentence should be. That said, part of the job of enforcing the rule of law and making sure you hold people accountable in the system that we have, and other people have doubts about that system. We can talk about that. We can talk about jails. We do a lot about jails and making sure there's justice in the jails too, at Rikers Island, for example. But we want to make sure that justice is not only seen to be done, but also is uniform. So the principal role for the prosecutor, I think, in making a reasoned bit of advocacy for a particular sentence is mostly to say, here's what other people have been sentenced to in similar circumstances. If we presume those sentences to have been just, then, Your Honor, you should do something the same here. So, for example, in the cases of Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos, which are the cases that people are familiar with, we did not take the position, and nor do we usually take the position, but people think we do, that the harshest sentence that was permissible under law should be imposed. We were very deliberate about how, and we talked about it a lot in my office, what the position should be. Not that anyone necessarily cares about our position. It's up to the judge and the judge alone. Once upon a time, it was the case that these things known as the sentencing guidelines, when I was a line prosecutor, were mandatory. And there was a grid and a mathematical formula that you were supposed to engage in to figure out how much time someone should be sentenced for on the conviction of a federal crime. Those are now just advisory. So basically, a judge can sentence anyone to any amount of time lawfully, pretty much. And so our position was, in the briefs we sent to the court in both of those cases, we spent quite a number of pages laying out, in the Silver case, for example, what other politicians had been sentenced to for that period for similar kind of conduct, for violating their oath, pocketing a certain amount of money. And our conclusion was that the sentences ranged in the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York, basically the federal courts in New York, between the serious ones between, I think, 6 and 9 years, 5 and 9 years. And we said, based on the scope of the conduct, the amount of money that was involved, and the significance of the person, that Sheldon Silver had committed the most egregious public corruption offenses and had most undermined faith in our democratic system than any of the others. And we are not going to specify the particular sentence, but as a matter of advising the court, it should be something more than the other people. And basically, the court did that. So we see our responsibility as sort of advising the court of the possibilities and who the comparable folks have been.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up our discussion here. Preetinder, excuse me. This was a fascinating, informative discussion, and your insight is appreciated. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
I really
Thanks so
appreciate it.